let's get started. Thank you so much, Sarah and Mark, for joining the call. As I think many SAPIR readers know, we try to spotlight a few authors and essays with every new issue of SAPIR, now our 18th since we started in 2021, thanks to the backing of the Maimonides Fund. And I wish we could do every essay in the book because there's so many superb essays. Particularly, I should say, in our current issue, which is about activism. Our next issue is coming out in a few weeks on the subject of chosenness. But each of you have written essays, although you've written them independently, but they're really, in a sense, companion pieces. And more so than that, they are so exceptionally topical with what is happening really in just recent days. A judge's order to release this former student at Columbia, Hillel, and then, of course, what I think is on the minds of many American Jews, which is the New York City Democratic primary, in which there is a real chance that a militant anti-Zionist is going to be the Democratic nominee and likely the next mayor of the city of New York. And each of you have thought deeply on these and related topics. So the timing was fortuitous, but also very fortunate. So, Sarah, let me begin with you because you're the executive director of the New York Solidarity Network. You've worked for many years as a Democratic strategist and advisor and operative on campaigns. You've sort of looked at the I don't know the long course, but many years of the evolution of democratic politics, and particularly the evolution of democratic politics since around 2004, when Dennis Kucinich, that Democratic congressman from Ohio, considered radical at the time, strong anti-war activist, sort of became a surprise sensation in that race, along with Howard Dean, the governor of Vermont. And then bringing that forward all the way to the present, when certainly in 2020, Bernie Sanders, a socialist, nearly took the Democratic nomination away from Joe Biden. It was really just the intercession of Congressman Clyburn in South Carolina that saved that race for then former Vice President Joe Biden. I want to talk about the evolution of the Democratic Party, but I also want to talk about the evolution of Jews within the Democratic Party, because the majority of Jews have been voting for Democratic candidates pretty consistently, going all the way back, certainly into the days of the FDR. Now there's suddenly, among many Jews, a lot of discomfort with their political home. And you are wrestling with the question, Sarah, of how Jews should deal with that discomfort. And you lean on the work that's of a Jewish economist, Albert Hirschman, who wrote a book that probably should be more famous than it is today. Tell us about the work of Hirschman and tell us about how it informs your thinking in the party.
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. I really appreciate this. And given our timing with the election tomorrow, this couldn't come at a better time to actually have.
And I like your Jerry Ford poster right behind
Oh,
you.
I have every presidential campaign from the 20th century. It's
That's amazing.
my thing. But I have one poster, which this is Bella Abzug's literature from her run for Congress, and it's her pro-Israel piece. And if I showed it to you, if I pulled it forward and you saw all of the names of the people on there, Shirley Chisholm being one of them, and just saw the vast support for Israel that used to be so cardinal and such a tenet of democratic even left-leaning Democratic Party activism going back to the 70s. I think it would surprise a lot of people nowadays to realize that liberal icons were once absolutely just stalwart supporters of Israel without question. One of the reasons that Hirschman was so interesting to me is because the idea of fight or flight. Um, and he never, ever opted for flight. He always opted for fight. He always wanted to be in the thick of it, standing up for what was right, challenging the norm, risking himself. He had a far, far different experience than I've had in my life, to my great fortune. Um, you know, from fighting against the fascists in Spain to working for the US Foreign Service during World War II, to helping artists like Chagall escape from France through Spain, and eventually to Portugal and on to the United States. He's a fascinating economist that no one seems to know a whole lot about. And I was introduced to him by actually one of our big supporters and a dear friend of mine now. And it was the first meeting I ever had with this supporter. And he handed me the book and he said, "Have you ever heard of this before?" And I was like, "No." He's like, "Well, everything you just said to me about why we need to remake what's going on in the Democratic Party and recenter these thoughts around what's good for Jews and what isn't is in this book." And so I read it and I took it to heart and I kind of filed it away
So
for
the
almost,
book is from the 1950s?
yes, yes, actually early 1960s. And so I filed it away and I was waiting for an opportunity to actually talk about it where it felt right in the moment. And after the 2024 election, the national election, it seemed like this was a good time to bring up Hirschman's theory of exit, voice, and loyalty, right? So the loyalty being the measure of the two between exit and voice. And a lot of Democratic political infrastructure has, as we saw laid bare last year in the Harris-Trump race at the national level, really lean toward listening to the voices of the activists, the ones who are actually saying, no, 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 what the Democratic Party stands for is wrong, and here's how, and this is what we're going to tell you how to do it and how to be different, and this is why what we're saying is right. And they were taking a very hard line when it came to, shaping what the future of the Democratic Party would be like, and it didn't seem to include the nominee. And this is actually quite relevant to what's happening right now in New York City, because Zohran Mamdani, who is one of the candidates, one of the two leading candidates for mayor in New York, was a leader of the Leave It Blank campaign, we called it in New York, but that eventually evolved into the Uncommitted campaign nationally. He chose to remove himself, to exit from the Democratic Party nationally rather than endorse Kamala, which, I can't say in New York it made all that much of a difference. Kamala did win New York as in the electoral college votes from New York. But nationally, the uncommitted movement directly contributed to the election of Donald Trump. And it's this marriage between those who are pushing the Democratic Party so far to the left that they're causing Jews and people in the Democratic Party who have and Blacks and Latinos who have long made up the core constituencies of the party, the solid performers. As you said, it was Jim Clyburn who saved the nomination in 2020 for, Joe Biden. And Jews voted for Kamala, you know, at our usual very high pro-Democratic Party rate. Granted, there was an offshoot who were choosing to exit to vote for Trump, who were using the same similar tactics to the left, by not participating within the process and working to elect the party's nominee. But really, when you look at it from the 10,000-foot view, it's become very evident that party leadership doesn't exist anymore within the Democratic Party, and we're searching for someone in the party to provide direction, to give us an idea, to explain to us what exactly the Democratic Party stands for in 2025. And looking at the New York City election, it's a pretty interesting divide because you have Andrew Cuomo being one of the leading contenders who represents traditional liberal Democratic Party values that are closely aligned with Bill Clinton and just the the party lore that you think of when you think of a Democrat. And then you have Zoran with the Democratic Socialists, who aren't even really Democrats at all, but are, aligned with ideology put forth by Bernie Sanders and the far left. And I love that you brought up Dennis Kucinich, because he's one of these forgotten characters of history who actually, I think his campaign was the first Bernie Sanders campaign, of modern memory. His successes were largely copied by Bernie. Bernie kind of picked up that mantle and ran with it with that organization. Dean's campaign at the time was seen as, the establishment, if you will, campaign, which hard to imagine Howard Dean, as liberal as he was, coming from a state like Vermont, being seen as the establishment. But it was really Kucinich who was running from that Bernie lane in that initial election. Jews and Jewish voters remaining in the Democratic Party is something that I'm deeply committed to. I just like Hirschman, believe that there is no reason we need to give up the ground that we stand on. I still firmly believe in cardinal tenets of the Democratic Party, like choice, like gay rights, like things that are important socially that I just don't think the Republican Party is able to talk about in any kind of way that I'm able to relate to. And I
Let me interrupt you for 1 second. Mark, I want to get to you in just a minute, but I just want to drill down, since we're on the topic
Sure.
of the primary now about to take place in New York. You have a candidate who refuses to dissociate himself from the term globalize the Intifada. I don't think we've ever seen a candidate, with the exception of Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, who are frankly marginal figures in American politics, but a candidate who has so vocally put himself in the camp, not of peace in the Middle East or some criticism of Israel, but really in the camp of pro-militant, not only pro-Palestinian but pro-Hamas activists. Globalize the Intifada is a Hamasnik's mentality. If he becomes the nominee, what would you advise? How would you advise Jews to vote? I mean, is this one of those moments, like, for instance, when David Duke became the Republican nominee for governor in Louisiana in the early 1990s, where even the then sitting president George H.W. Bush urged every decent Republican to vote for Edwin Edwards, the Democratic alternative? Is that one of those moments when this poses a risk to your Democratic Party, because he would inevitably become a major figure in the party as the mayor of New York? Would you want someone like Curtis? Would you prefer someone like Curtis Sliwa, the guardian angel, to win if Mamdani is the nominee?
I mean, here's the thing. If Mamdani is the nominee, it's not just going to be a straight up Republican and Democratic race anyway in November. We have, Cuomo has petitioned as an independent to run through November. Eric Adams, the sitting incumbent mayor of New York City, has petitioned to run as an independent through November. Jim Walden, who's a libertarian-ish outsider candidate, has petitioned to run as an independent. And like you said, Sliwa and Zoran would all be on the ballot. We're going to, I think, face a situation where we have Zoran on the ballot no matter what, because the Working Families Party in New York, which I'm not sure for the national people who might be paying attention to this call right now, Working Families Party is a third party that has a ballot line in New York, which has a very difficult path to getting on to a third party line. And so Zoran will run as a Working Families Party candidate, we all are assuming, given that he was granted their #1 rank in our city's ranked choice voting primary. And, he'll be on the ballot, we think, no matter what happens tomorrow. The issue here is going to be, what should Jews do? That's your question. To me, I think Jews should do everything they can to vote against Mamdani tomorrow. And I've been advising them to do so for the last 9 days of early voting. Today is the first day there hasn't been early voting in 9 days. And, should he win, I think it's going to be up to Jews to really take a moment and start to think about who is the best candidate, best situated to go against Mamdani as a Working Families Party / Democratic Party nominee should he win tomorrow. I still don't believe he's going to pull it off. I think he did very well in early voting. We saw that with the increase in turnout from 18 to 34-year-olds who he was directly speaking to, knocking on their doors, telling them exactly what they wanted to hear about affordability, not telling them that he wanted to globalize the Intifada and that he was a socialist, to be clear. He was running on this crazy message of free. And it's very difficult, anything with democratic socialists, for those who have never participated in the process against them. I have, because I work at the state and local level, and we have a lot of these challenges. Democratic socialists say things in 3-word slogans. Every single thing they stand for fits in 3 words. It's very neat, it's very clean, it's beautifully choreographed with gorgeous graphics, great fonts, things that are appealing to the eye, catchy videos, things that are meant to like lure you in. And then once you are, part of their system, then you kind of start to read the fine print and figure out, well, the mayor can't actually make the bus free, even though he's telling you he can do this. This comes from Albany. Well, the mayor can't actually freeze the rent. He can only freeze the rent on rent stabilized units or rent controlled units. He cannot do anything that he's actually promising to do. And so should he be elected, it's going to be a very interesting, very quick cliff that he's going to fall off of, much like Brandon Johnson in Chicago. I'm not sure if you're familiar.
Well, Brandon Johnson became the mayor of the mayor of Chicago. Of course, Mamdani comes from a very well-to-do family, so for him, effectively throughout most of his life, everything has been free. So you can see why. You can see why he's an advocate. Mark, I want to turn to you with your co-writer Baruch Weiss. You wrote really, I think, an exceptionally important and interesting essay for our issue on the subject of lawfare and the Jewish use of lawfare, which really dates back to the 1920s, and another unheralded voice in Jewish history, Aaron Shapiro, who brought a libel case against Henry Ford in the 1920s for the rank anti-Semitism of his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. Ford actually, the case was so effective that Ford essentially settled the case and ceased publishing the Dearborn Independent. It was one of the great early uses of lawfare for American Jews. And I'm particularly interested in talking to you about this because, I mean, right now you're the general counsel of Hillel International. You've been general counsel at the University of Minnesota and also Johns Hopkins University, which is a school that's very close to my heart. So you've seen these issues around law in the university from multiple perspectives. I would say up until last year, there was a lot of support within the Jewish community for the use of, I mean, what we're calling lawfare. Really, it's the use of the law for the sake of making sure that Jews, especially on campus, receive the same protections guaranteed by Title VI as other minorities, and that was put to use in a variety of ways, very effectively by people like Ken Marcus, but also with the Brandeis Center and many others. Since Donald Trump became president and began to use the power of the executive against universities, which is somewhat different from lawfare, but it's using his powers appropriate and perhaps dubious against universities. I think there's a lot more skepticism about within the Jewish community about using the law against some of these schools, or certainly some of the threats that the administration has either issued or the penalties they've imposed against places like Harvard and Columbia and I guess some other universities, Johns Hopkins, as a matter of fact, as well. talk us through, as you see it, the appropriate uses of, I guess, what we're calling lawfare, and the abuses of it, and which ones fit the broad interests of the Jewish community and which ones might hurt us.
Yes. Well, thank you, Bret, for that question. And thank you, Sara, for educating me. I don't live in New York, but I'm sure hundreds of the people who are listening about the politics that is roiling the waters in New York City. I have children and grandchildren in New York City, and it's very important, I think, for our community to be aware of that. But thank you, Bret, and thanks to SAPIR for hosting this podcast on both of these issues. I will refrain from commenting about the New York situation, since the learning curve was straight up during Sara's explanation for me. Bret, the situation as you described it is contextualized in our article that Baruch Weiss and I wrote. As you noted, Aaron Sapiro brought a suit back in the 1920s that was spectacularly successful, but for most of the period of the post World War II era, there was no litigation really involving institutions of higher education brought by the Jewish community, because higher ed was a location of inclusivity, right, of opportunity for the Jewish community. Indeed, there's no other area of the American economy that has seen more overrepresentation, more inclusivity, more opportunity for advancement in American life and culture than institutions of higher education. And so for a very long period of time, legal tools were not only unused, but they were really unneeded by the Jewish community. Hillel International, which I serve as its general counsel, didn't even start counting anti-Semitic incidents in higher ed spaces until 2013. And we are overwhelmingly the dominant location for Jewish people in institutions of higher education. We have boots on the ground and bricks and mortar at hundreds of schools across North America. So the use of the law to protect the rights of Jewish students in particular, but also Jewish faculty and administrators, is a very recent phenomenon in the space of university life. And your question, of course, is vitally important right now, because the Trump administration, unlike prior administrations, going back all the way to the Bush, George W. Bush administration, has taken a very, very dramatically different approach to this problem. Up until the Trump 2 administration, there was bipartisan understanding, again, beginning in the early 2000s, when Jewish students were recognized under Title VI as being protected by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The legal history of that is, by the way, very interesting. Like, why did it happen then when the Civil Rights Act had been around for 50 years or so, 40 years? That's an interesting question that we can discuss some other time. But beginning during that period, there was a bipartisan understanding that Jewish students were protected, but the administrative apparatus that the executive branch used, right, which was principally in the Department of Education, the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education, was a very tedious one. That process involved a long effort to investigate the climate for Jewish students on the campus and negotiating with the administration of the university how they could improve it, so that the ultimate penalty, the so-called death penalty of suspending federal funding for the school, which was always there as a tool, right, would not be used. And until the Trump second administration, the present Trump administration, no university had ever been subjected to that so-called death penalty, right? So now, as Bret, as you're saying, we now have a dramatically different governmental weapon, and it's really seen that way by higher ed administrators with whom I talk every day, being wielded against these universities, ostensibly under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, to enforce the rights of Jewish students to an equal educational opportunity, right? Now, it's quite apparent, not only to the people in higher ed spaces, but to anyone reading what President Trump and Leo Terrell, the chair of the DOJ task force, the Department of Justice task force, which has been assigned responsibility for eliminating anti-Semitism in higher ed spaces, that their agenda transcends that of the Jewish community. Right? No reasonable person reading what they have said about what's going on, about Harvard, about Columbia, about Hopkins, about Northwestern, and so forth and so on, can fail to appreciate that there are many other things going on using the ostensible tool under Title VI to withdraw federal funding. Now, there are other tools that are being used, right, as well. There's a TRO that was issued against the Trump effort to ban international students from attending Harvard University. There is enormous and very burdensome record requests that have been imposed on institutions of higher education. And then, of course, there are the very well-known funding suspensions at a half a dozen or more universities. Billions of dollars have been suspended. And one can reasonably ask, right, what is the nexus? What is the relationship between suspending, say, just to take one example, $46 million in tuberculosis research, have to do with the battle against anti-Semitism at Harvard College? The researchers, by the way, you know this, we referenced this in the article, the researchers whose projects are being suspended are disproportionately, meaning as a percentage of the population in the United States, Jewish physicians and PhDs. They're the people whose work is being essentially impaired by these funding suspensions. And of course, as we know, or the people that follow this, maybe I shouldn't say of course, I'm kind of a nerd in this area, right? The people that follow these federal court injunctions and actions against the administration by Harvard and some other schools have seen a substantial amount of success, right? The administration has a very tough row to hoe here in terms of succeeding in the courts, because the use of these tools in this way, right? First you suspend and then you investigate, is not precedented. It's unprecedented. The old way, as I explained, was to investigate first and try to settle with the school and then use the funding suspension as an ultimate weapon to encourage or coerce compliance with Title VI, right? So the way in which the administration is going about this is very fraught and uncertain at this time. The burden of our article, as those of you who read it know, is to advocate for Jewish legal activism, which we believe is indispensable at this time. So instead of outsourcing these legal tools to others who may have our interests in mind, of course, but also other interests having to do with wokeism and destroying DEI, as that term is used and misused and so forth. Our community needs to assume its own responsibility, sort of like Aaron Sapiro in the 1920s, to assert high pressure on universities to crack down quickly on anti-Semitic harassment and remedy those situations at a time now where the law is being reshaped in our favor. So that's the kind of the burden of our essay. That's what we're advocating for. And we believe that we can now obtain very favorable settlements with schools because there's a interest by higher ed administrators. If I may say just this last point, Bret, I talk with higher ed leaders all the time, and I think they really understand this now. They got religion. They understand that there's an unprecedented spike in anti-Semitism on their campuses. They understand how unprepared they were, and they understand that they have to come to grips with this in order to control their own mission success. And that's the way we're appealing. That's the way Hillel is appealing to them, that their own mission is at stake. Because when an orthodoxy, an intellectual orthodoxy of intolerance takes over whole departments, whole colleges even sometimes, right? Their mission of intellectual curiosity and discovery and thinking across difference is impaired, right? So leave the Jews completely aside. I think the opportunity here now is one that the Jewish community should take advantage of.
So I want to turn to you, Sara. And by the way, just to stress, we'll leave a few minutes at the end of the session for questions from our participants. So there's to those of you who are listening in, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And as Mark and Sara say things that provoke curiosity, rage, or any other emotions, put in those questions and I'll try to get to them as many as possible. So I want to ask you about the position of the kind of mainstream Democratic Party, which is really caught between sort of the proverbial Scylla and Charybdis here, like Odysseus on his journeys. On the one hand, right, there is an almost I don't want to say knee-jerk, but there's a reasonable reflex that if the Trump administration does X, opposite X is the correct response, right? So there's a sense that everything that the Trump administration should not only be distrusted but vehemently opposed, right? On the other hand, there is real fear, I think, among mainstream Democrats about what the far left of the Democratic Party has become or is becoming. And when I talk to Democratic leaders, especially when it comes to subjects like protest on campus or the politics of Israel-Palestine, they become really tongue-tied, or they kind of fall back on shop-worn cliches. They seem old and tired. They don't seem to have a particularly good vocabulary for expressing themselves in a way that is, I think, convincing, particularly to younger Democratic voters. So imagine you're advising a potentially serious candidate for the Democratic nomination in the next election cycle. How does he talk about, or she talk about some of these issues with respect to the Democratic Party's view on protest, dissent, but also respect for Jewish communities and a belief that injunctions against hate speech should be applied uniformly? Give us a kind of a vocabulary for that candidate.
I mean, that is an excellent question. Thank you for asking. I want to just take a whole framing of this first. So in my piece in SAPIR, actually, I talk about how the Democratic Party needs to buck up, and moderates and liberals need to take it back from the activist class who have controlled language. They've become language police. They've decided that these are the parameters for what we can and cannot speak about, and this is the end of the conversation. There's no more thought. There's no more back and forth narrative. Nothing. It's always just black and white, which is not the typical Democratic Party way. You know, it's very interesting that you bring up the absolutism about Donald Trump. I mean, I didn't vote for Donald Trump, but I'm not certainly going to say that every single thing he does is going to be, you know, the antithesis of what we would expect our president to do. I mean, yes, he makes terrible decisions and is very erratic and is as, volatile and uncontrollable as many of those leaders on the far left. But what I think is interesting is that sometimes a broken clock is right twice a day, they say, to
That's an expression.
hit up your cliche. Um, but it was very evident in the bombing of the Iranian nuclear facilities over the weekend that we've a little bit lost the plot as a Democratic Party, at least in terms of leadership and where they stand on the overall issue of having a nuclear Iran. It used to be that it was pretty much understood that Iran was bad. And at least both political parties had a bipartisan agreement and a handshake that it was okay to do things to bad people who were seeking to harm us and who have harmed us over the course of decades of terrorism and funding of terrorism and supporting of terrorism, especially against the Jewish communities, not only in the United States, but abroad. I mean, just look at the Buenos Aires bombing. I think that was in 1994. I mean, Iran was
31
responsible
years
for that.
ago, the Amia
Yeah.
bombing.
Yes. I mean, so, the fact that more Democrats put out statements cheering on, the release of Mahmoud Khalil than in support of Israel as they're being attacked by Iranian missiles should tell you that there's definitely a crisis of leadership and a lot of listening to an activist class that is not reflective of what the National Democratic Party beliefs are. Because in polls, time and again, it shows that most self-identified Democrats in this country are absolutely supportive of taking out the Iranian nuclear threat. So there's a disconnect, first of all, to start with the first part of your question. There's a disconnect between party leadership and the party itself and the membership. And there's also this very interesting younger voters versus older voters versus who counts the most in a primary kind of conversation that's going on right now. And, not just to bring it back to New York, but to like center it on the Jewish community as the whole, you can look at the coalitions that, for example, Andrew Cuomo has put together of your traditional Jews, Blacks, and Latinos. And then you look at the Mamdani coalition, white, youthful, extremely college educated. Um, it says this about the broader landscape of the Democratic tent and the strain in this tent to kind of hold everybody together, because stopping Mamdani in this moment means dampening the hopes of the left nationwide, as you alluded to before. If he were to be elected, not only would we be electing a socialist, the mayor of New York City, we'd be electing a new far left king, effectively, for the
So
country.
one example that comes to mind is the example of Jamal Bowman, the former congressman from my neck of the woods in Westchester, who staged a kind of a surprise primary. I don't mean this invidiously, but a primary coup against his complacent predecessor, Elliot Engel, longtime Jewish congressman,
Yep.
and then went hard left. And George Latimer, a moderate Democrat, was able to put together a coalition of what I would say are mainstream Democrats to unseat him in the primary. Now, Latimer is of course the congressman. What are some of the efforts that sort of centrist leaning Jews can get behind to make sure that the Democrats who are in office aren't simply winning very narrow primaries when everyone else is kind of away and not voting during primary season? Like how do you actually do those politics? Making sure. I mean, one point that I think is significant is you have a New York primary in late June when people have left the city, and they're really not to be found anywhere near their polling places. They're not thinking about politics as they do in November. How do you actually organize that kind of politics to make sure that you're not left with a Jamal Bowman or a Mamdani?
I mean, the fact remains that New York is a closed primary system. Unlike many of the other states in the country, the laws are a throwback to the Tammany Hall days. You have to change your party registration by February 14th of the year prior to the primary election. So if you're a registered, we call them blanks or unaffiliated. In New York, independents, they call them in other states. Your voice is completely meaningless and lost. And if you haven't re-registered by February 14th, you can't participate. So we've already narrowed the electorate down to a very small percentage of overall Democrats generally in New York. That's part one of the problem. Part two, with the timing, yes, it's chosen on purpose because protecting the power of the incumbency is always kind of the paramount for any, New York is fully controlled by Democrats from the state to the legislative to the federal to the local to the municipal level, other than Long Island, where there's a little bit of Republican election control. For the most part, the entire state is a fully Democratic state that's fully functional in one silo. Opening the primary up to independents is one way that this could potentially help with moderating the voters, because many of the independents are former Democrats who are just sick of the process and decided they wanted to disaffiliate. The thing that's interesting, you had asked me before about what I would tell a candidate of the future, how you could possibly talk about Israel and Palestine and also, have a compelling electoral message. At least I can speak from the state and local perspective. I think that ties very deeply into what we need to explain to the voters. Far too often, the state and local elected offices are the ones that are the throwaways. Everybody knew about the race with Bowman and Latimer last year, and it was excellent that there was such a heightened voter awareness of what was going on. Voters knew that Bowman was not good for their district and he wasn't representing them, and he was far, far, far to the left and representative of a fringe. And Latimer was a state and local elected official who had served for decades, knew everybody's name, knew who was on the library board in any of the towns in Westchester. I mean, he was a very good retail politician, despite the fact that he wasn't young like Bowman is, and he wasn't, particularly flashy about things. It's not necessarily about the personality, it's more about the substance. And getting voters to pay attention and participate in local elections like our mayoral primary tomorrow is one way of taking the National Democratic Party by the shoulders and saying, hey, you got to pay attention to what's going on here before you can have your dream scenario candidate that could win back the presidency.
Yeah. Yeah.
They've missed that. That plot has a little bit been lost.
Mark, there's an argument that I hear made and even acknowledged among some university leaders that as crass and as brutish or brutal as the Trump administration's moves against Harvard and Columbia and other universities have been, that what in effect, the net effect of it is that it is like an asteroid hitting the Earth at a high rate of speed, and that universities needed that kind of gigantic fear of God moment that the Trump administration is offering in order to get them to change. That it's just the moves that they were prepared to undertake, a little bit of viewpoint diversity here and there, an effort to bring in a conservative scholar to one or two departments were effectively cosmetic, and there was something that went so deep, that was so deeply wrong with the way universities have evolved in the last 15 or 20 years, that this is kind of the hard but necessary medicine, and that it will shake out or it can shake out in a healthier way for Jewish students. First of all, do you think there's anything to that analysis that's valid, that is as unfortunate as some of what the administration is doing now, that it might be healthy in the long term? And if it is, like, what does health look like? How do we go back to a university campus that looked like my University of Chicago in the 1990s, or other schools that felt like places that were homes of inquiry of different points of view, and that were exceptionally friendly to students of every stripe, but exceptionally friendly to Jewish students?
Yes, great question, Bret. So here's my take on this, as someone who operates in this space full time. It is true and it is accurate to say, as you observed, that the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, medicine has been very, very hard to swallow. But it has resulted in dramatically enhanced awareness. And you just have to take the principal examples of Harvard and Columbia, where the administration has focused its most high visibility attacks. Columbia University took many, many steps in response to the $400 million plus of federal funding suspension. Not all, but many, many steps that were recommended both by Hillel, other Jewish organizations, and by its own faculty-led anti-Semitism task force. And many other universities who have not been the subject of these very high visibility attacks have made not cosmetic, but important changes, especially in the area of time, place, and manner regulations, right? These are things that can be done relatively quickly, and they have an enormous immediate impact on the campus physical climate, right, for Jewish students. Up until last spring, most campuses, and again, you want to focus on Columbia and Harvard as the administration does, that you can use those as good examples. Universities did not enforce their TPM regulations. They did not publicize their TPM regulations, and most students felt free to ignore what they had, right? And even at Harvard, when they did enforce the regulations and tried to make examples out of a handful of students and withhold their diplomas for flagrant violations of the university's regulations governing protest activity, the faculty voted to grant those diplomas over the objections of the administration. So this points to a much deeper problem, which the Trump administration medicine is not going to address fully and effectively. And that has to do with a much deeper climate of hostility to what our opponents have now taken over the word Zionism, right? Their opposition to Zionism and Zionists on the campus has become so deep rooted in many tenured faculty settings and many student orgs, the registered student organizations, that publicly and explicitly in writing, like at UCal Berkeley Law School, will exclude people who they deem to be speaking for Zionism, right? And Erwin Chemerinsky, one of the highest regarded First Amendment scholars in the United States, the dean of the University of California Law School, has decried those exclusions as anti-Semitic, but he declined to actually do anything about them at his school. And so the Trump administration remedies that you refer to and that I described have been very effective in creating a number of what might call superficial but very important quick remedies. And we at Hillel endorse those remedies and support those milestones. We have very clearly set out milestones for universities to get better at this kind of stuff, to go from A to B to C. We want to see those improvements for our students because we can't wait for 15 or 20 years. We have hundreds of thousands of Jewish students on our 800 plus campuses and elsewhere where Hillel does not operate, and they need assistance now. So these remedies are very important, but they don't address the deeper problems with the higher ed space that have created a climate of bullying, intimidation, exclusion, marginalization, all those terms. And we as lawyers call those violations of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And the Jewish community has to get its act together and utilize legal tools and other tools okay, and other tools, to make sure that these institutions are, again, welcoming and inclusive of a historically marginalized population, the Jewish community.
Mark, I want to turn to some of the questions from our participants. I should have left a little more time for them, and I apologize to the audience. But let me get to one of them that I think ties right into what you just said, Mark, which is a question from Stella Belenkaya, and she asks, what do you think the role of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is in the resurgence of anti-Semitism, and should we fight it? And I think her point really is that these offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are on almost every single campus, ostensibly for the benefit of all students, but especially all minority students, have adopted ideologies or pedagogies or methods that are in effect exclude Jews, certainly excludes Zionist Jews, and I don't think I'm saying something that goes too far, that have become more of a part of the problem in the life of Jewish students than part of the solution. So, operating with Hillel, how do you view these programs? Are they reformable? Can you talk to DEI administrators, or do you think that they really need to go if the situation for Jewish students can change for the better?
Yes. So I'll back up a little bit and offer some framing, but the bottom line answer, Bret, is yes, they can be reformed, but they need to be radically reformed. Okay, they're not going away, and let me explain why. When I started and took my first job as the chief legal officer at the University of Minnesota in the mid-1990s, there were no DEI offices, or at least very, very few. This is a brand new situation in the last 20 some years. DEI offices now are ubiquitous, as you noted. There are thousands of people on university campuses who are engaged in DEI activities. Some states have banned DEI at their public universities, Florida, Texas, and other states. And Hillel works with those institutions that don't have DEI offices to improve the lives of Jewish students. But most states and most private universities still have large DEI functions. And again, when I talk to hundreds, we've had hundreds of DEI administrators attending our educational and training opportunities, and we urge them to adopt certain milestones for performance so that they can improve the lives for Jewish students. When I talk to those people, not a single one of them says that their DEI office was created with Jewish students in mind. Okay, so what we're operating in here is like an English department that needs to teach mathematics, right? These units were not created to focus on Jewish students, and sadly, over time, many DEI units were infected by a bias against Jewish students, stereotyping Jewish students as white, privileged kids from Scarsdale, right? And that won't work, right? It won't work for Jewish students if the composition and bias of the DEI officers is in that direction. So one option, as we all know, is the option that has been adopted in certain states to simply ban the offices. You see, but the point needs to be made that nobody is convinced by that, right? By banning the office, you don't ban the ideas and the biases and the prejudices and the hostilities against Zionists, right? They are simply dispersed into different areas, and they still continue to exist on campus. So the destruction of a DEI office does not actually cure the deeper problem, and the Jewish community has to acknowledge that there is a deeper situation in regard of biases and prejudices against our students than simply banning the departments. And one last point. When we train and deal with these DEI officers, there is a component inside these offices of individuals who will acknowledge the spike in campus anti-Semitism, the fact that they were unprepared to deal with it, the fact that Jewish students have been excluded and cannot take courses from certain professors, because those professors are so overtly hostile to their own ethnic identities. There are DEI officers who understand that now and want to deal with it. So you can either say, forget about them, just fire them, right? As though the universities operated like private businesses, which they don't, right? See, that's another thing the Jewish community has to acknowledge, that universities don't operate like a private corporation where the board of directors and the CEO can simply announce a new initiative, like Musk at Tesla, right? Harvard University does not operate in that way, right? And Larry Summers or Alan Garber cannot simply announce that Harvard will decide to do something and all of the faculty march in line. It rather operates in the opposite, right? Larry Summers lost his job because he gave offered some remarks at a private setting off the record, and the faculty got so upset at him that they got him fired, right? Can you imagine a corporation that operates like that? It doesn't. So the Jewish community has to understand how these DEI units operate, how universities operate, and try to establish some benchmarks of performance so that our students can be included rather than marginalized.
Okay, now a question for Sara. So the question comes from Sheldon K. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so give us a brief answer. What specific steps can be taken to engage moderate Jews to be part of the Democratic Party? The party has become so far to the left, I think he means to say, that I, as a Jew, no longer can support it. We have Jewish senators criticizing Trump for taking action against Iran. You were typing an answer, but give us an answer to Sheldon.
I could just tell you exactly what it is. So I think we need to use our voices to amplify the moderate center-left coalition that is still the majority of the Democratic Party. I cannot stress this enough. We are allowing a fringe element of our party to dictate our future, to dictate our present. We cannot allow this to occur anymore. And you know what? They get calls from the left. The thing that the left has that we do not have the luxury of having is time. Most of us work, we have extensive lives that we live. We're not solely thinking about politics all of the time. And here's what we need to do. For every 40 calls they get condemning Trump for bombing Iran, we need to have 400 calls come in to those senators and Congress members' offices applauding the action of taking out a nuclear risk that not only threatens our U.S. service members serving in the Middle East and any American functionally traveling abroad or even in the United States, for all we know. We need to call our people. We need to engage. We need to bring back political participation of the center left, because the reason why the far left has the last word is because they're the only ones speaking up. We need to find our voices again. We need to exercise our voices, and we need to come together and organize ourselves behind what we believe in. And if we are still the type of, I still think classical liberals, center left, like Bella Abzug on this poster behind me represent, we need to stand up and we need to show our elected officials that we're here and you can count on us to support you if you have our backs. The Jewish community right now needs to hear that they have our backs too. And I think that's how we can start this. It's a slow process, but we need to get it going.
It says something about the politics of our time that we can look back on Bella Abzug as a classical liberal from the center.
Right.
That's not the way she was seen, I think, when she ran against Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Mark, Sara, I want to thank you both for a really interesting discussion. I think we could have done this for another hour at least, because there's so many pressing questions. Most pressing of all, note just came in over the transom as I was speaking to you. Iranian missiles are headed for a U.S. airbase in Qatar. So I hope very much that none of them harm another human being, certainly not an American service member. We'll see where that other story takes us. But Mark and Sara, thank you for participating in these conversations, which are so important to what we're trying to do at SAPIR, which is to offer ideas for a thriving Jewish future. Thanks a million again, and let's hope for the best.
Thank you so much for having us.